So, as I always say, and as I've been saying for the last couple years, Adam and Eve didn't exist. And no, that doesn't mean the entire Bible is not true. Shut the hell up for 5 minutes. Just shut the hell up. The Adam and Eve story was never intended to be taken literally to begin with. Most people's understanding about how the Adam and Eve story came to be is most people think that the book of Genesis is the first book in the Hebrew Bible. That's wrong. The first book in the Hebrew Bible actually is Job. Then it's Deuteronomy. Then it's Exodus. Leviticus, Numbers, then Genesis. Genesis chapters 12 to 50, which possibly would have been written around the time of King David, long after Moses. If you notice, Moses never quotes from the book of Genesis. The Israelites in the wilderness never quote from the book of Genesis. They don't have a scroll of Genesis because it didn't exist. Most people think that the book of Genesis was written by Moses because the 1611 King James Bible, its title for Genesis is Genesis, the first 5 books of Moses. But just because the 1611 King James Bible says Moses wrote Genesis, that doesn't mean Moses actually wrote Genesis. So when was Genesis written? Genesis chapters 1 to 11 was written after Genesis chapters 12 to 50. Genesis 1 to 11 was written when the Israelites were in the Babylonian captivity. We know this because Genesis 1 to 11 uses Babylonian words, Babylonian cognates, and it has Babylonian themes. Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, when it says the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep, that Hebrew word is tehom. Tehom is a Hebrew word, but it is in an Akkadian cognate. So it is a Babylonian cognate of the word Tiamat. So in your Hebrew Bibles, when it says the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep in Babylonian cosmology, that Hebrew word is actually a name. The deep, or Tehom, is a name of a Babylonian god named Tiamat. So the image that Genesis is trying to give is, in the beginning, God was hovering above the face of Tiamat, the Babylonian goddess of the waters. So if you are a Babylonian and if you were reading through Genesis, you would know exactly what Genesis is trying to say. That in the beginning, it was the God of the Hebrews who was hovering above the face of your Babylonian God. And why would a Hebrew write this? Because a Hebrew would have been responding to Babylonian folklore and myths if a Hebrew was in Babylon. And when would the Hebrews be in Babylon? When the Hebrews were in Babylonian captivity. Which is why the Adam and Eve account is so similar to other Babylonian stories, like the Babylonian story of Adapa. The story of Adapa is about the first man. He's the first king. He is tricked by his patron god to not eat from the bread of life and the water of life. And that is the Babylonian version of why humans are not immortal, because their creation story character named Adapa, he didn't eat from the bread of life and the water of life. So if the Babylonian gods, if they became the gods who became popular around the world, people wouldn't believe in Adam and Eve. People would believe in the Babylonian version of creation, the story of Adapa. But the Israelites made the Adam and Eve story when they were in captivity. It didn't come from Moses on a mountain. It didn't come out the sky. The story of Adam and Eve, it came while the Israelites were in captivity because they forgot who they were. The Israelites were in captivity for 40 years. So as a way to preserve their history, they created the story of Adam and Eve so they could remember who they were, so they could preserve their history. When the Israelites were taken into Babylonian captivity in 595 BC, They lost their temple, they lost their land, and they were in a land far away from home. So they created this story. This is why the author of the story has God creating the world in 7 days. Well, if you don't know better, that is actually taken from somewhere else in the Hebrew Bible. Remember, Genesis is not the first book. Genesis is one of the last books. And Genesis is pulling from other books. Genesis chapter 1 particularly is pulling from 1 Kings chapter 5. When King Solomon, he builds the first physical temple of God, and it takes Solomon 7 years to build the first temple. And just like it takes Solomon 7 years to build the first temple of God, that is why the author of Genesis has God creating the world in 7 days. Because Genesis 1 is a temple motif to the original physical temple that the Israelites lost. Just like Solomon built the first temple that the Israelites lost to captivity, the author has God making the world in 7 days because he's looking back at the paradise that the Israelites lost before they went into captivity. Genesis chapters 1 to 11 is a memoir to the paradise that the Israelites lost. When people think about the past, they usually think about the past better than what it was. More colorful, more brighter. Whenever you look at older people and they talk about the good old days, the good old days were not necessarily better. It's just that human psychology, we always remember the past better than it actually was. And the Israelites who are writing the story in Genesis, they are looking back at Israel and they remember Israel as a paradise. They remember Israel as a Garden of Eden. And Adam is Israel, the nation. Adam is a son of God. Israel is a son of God. Adam is a priest. Israel is a nation of priests. Even when Eve is made from Adam's side, Adam says, "You are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone." Those words are directly said by the nation of Israel in 2 Samuel chapter 5, which 2 Samuel, once again, was written before Genesis. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1, the nation of Israel comes before King David, and they say, "David, we are your flesh and bone." Because the person of Adam in the Genesis story is Israel. And the Garden of Eden is the land of Israel. And this is a retelling about how God placed Israel in the land and how when Israel disobeyed God, they were exiled. And that story is being retold in Genesis in a metaphorical way to a brand new audience who would have been little Babylonian Israelites. So this story is being told in a palatable way that a new audience would be able to understand it. So no, Adam and Eve didn't exist. Adam and Eve actually represent the nation of Israel. I go into why they have genealogies and what do those genealogies actually mean according to the culture. Because I'm going to be honest, after 10 minutes of watching this, I know there's going to be a lot of dickheads who are going to be like, "Oh, I don't get it," or "It doesn't make sense." Look, listen. The reason why the Bible doesn't make sense to a lot of people is because most everyday people don't know anything about cultural context. The Bible was not written directly to you. The person who wrote on that papyrus was writing to a specific audience, and that audience already had a context. The author didn't need to catch them up. The author could assume that his audience already knew certain things he was writing about. We are the ones who we don't know who the author is directly talking about, or we don't know the context clues because we live in a completely different culture. But I talk about this stuff in my books, Secrets of the Bible from the East. You can get my books by going to the link in my bio. They come in a bundle. There's 3 books that come in the Secrets of the Bible bundle. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, link is in my bio. I got to get off here.